March 17th, 1952, Kunsan Air Base, South Korea. The sirens screamed before the dust even settled. On the horizon, black smoke clawed at the sky where a formation of F-86 Sabres had just vanished under enemy fire. Minutes later, the radio crackled with a single voice, ragged, disbelieving. "This is Eagle 3. I'm still airborne." Every man in the control tower froze. That jet had taken a direct hit to its electrical core. No power, no controls, nothing. Yet somehow, through the haze of oil and fire, it was gliding home. When the crippled aircraft finally slammed onto the runway, sparks erupted like a comet scraping the earth. The ground crew raced forward, expecting a funeral. Instead, the cockpit opened, and a pilot stumbled out, alive, trembling, whispering one name, Ward. In that instant, confusion ripped through the base. Regulations said this was impossible. Engineering manuals said a Sabre without power was a coffin in the sky. But somewhere behind those hangars, a mechanic, no one paid attention to Eli Ward. The quiet man with oil-stained hands had done something forbidden, something that broke every rule and just saved a man's life. The officers demanded answers. The engineers demanded logic. Ward offered neither. He only wiped his hands, looked toward the burning jet and said, "It wasn't luck, it was design." What he meant would shake the entire Air Force to its core. If you want to know how one man rewired death itself, stay with us, hit like, subscribe and share this story, because what comes next will make you question everything you thought you knew about heroism, obedience, and survival. The hangar lights flickered as Eli Ward walked past the wreckage of the smoking Sabre. Men shouted, officers barked, orders, radios hissed, but he heard none of it. His world had always been made of humming circuits and stubborn metal, not noise. The pilot who'd survived was sitting on the tarmac, still trembling, whispering his name like a secret that wasn't supposed to exist. Ward didn't look back. He just kept walking until the chaos faded behind the clang of his boots and the hum of a generator echoing down the maintenance bay. That sound, steady, electric, alive, was the only rhythm that ever made sense to him. He had been building things since he was 8 years old in a barn behind his father's house in central Texas. The Ward farm was poor, but the junk pile was endless. Old tractor parts, radio guts, broken wires, every piece was a lesson. His father worked long hours in the fields, and Eli learned early that machines only respected one thing, persistence. When other boys played ball, he took apart engines. He found beauty in rust and reason in failure. If something sparked, rattled, or died, he stayed up until dawn, figuring out why. His mother used to scold him for sleeping beside the workbench, his hands still black with oil. But she never stopped him. She said he had the kind of stubborn that could light a storm. By 20, the Depression had ended, but the wars hadn't. Korea was burning, and the recruiters promised steady pay for anyone who could keep the birds flying. Ward didn't join for the flag or the uniform. He joined because, in his words, airplanes were the closest thing to truth a man could touch. Machines didn't lie. They either worked or they didn't. And he trusted that kind of honesty more than any officer's speech. When he arrived at Kunsan Air Base in 1951, he didn't fit the mold. The other mechanics wore polished boots and quoted regulations. Ward wore the same denim jacket he'd worn in Texas, patched with wire burns and coffee stains. He didn't salute as sharply as others. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it cut through the noise like static on a broken radio. The commanding officer called him the mule, stubborn, hard to move, impossible to ignore. In his first week, he watched a pilot taxi out in a brand-new F-86 gleaming silver under the morning Sunday. The squadron commander bragged about its engineering, triple redundancy, state-of-the-art electronics, indestructible by design. An hour later, that same jet came spiraling back to Earth, trailing smoke-dead, stick-dead systems. The crash killed both the pilot and the myth. Ward helped drag the twisted wreck from the field. He stared at the melted wires, the burnt relay, the single cable that had fed half the aircraft's electrical core. 1 point of failure, 1 inch of copper, and the plane was gone. That night in the maintenance shed, he said it out loud for the first time. "These planes ain't built wrong, they're built blind." His crew chief, a by-the-book sergeant from Ohio, told him to shut up and stick to the manual. But Ward wasn't built to obey paper. "Manuals don't fly the plane," he muttered. "People do." The next morning he started testing. He'd take damaged parts home to the tiny barracks room where he'd rigged a makeshift lab out of spare cables, broken transformers, and an old voltmeter. While others drank or played cards, he studied patterns of failure, every frayed wire, every shorted switch. He filled notebooks with diagrams, scrawled notes in grease pencil across the walls. He wasn't chasing credit or glory. He was chasing understanding the kind engineers in Washington never saw, because they weren't the ones picking blood and metal off the runway. Ward's world at the base was half war, half workshop. Outside the hangar doors, the night sky pulsed with anti-aircraft flashes from across the border. Inside, under the yellow lamps, his hands worked like a surgeon's, slow, precise, defiant. Pilots came and went. Some didn't come back, but the ones who did started noticing something odd. The planes Ward touched seemed to hold together just a little longer, fly a little farther. A rumor started circling the flight line: if Ward signed off on your bird, you'd make it home. He didn't like the talk. To him, luck was an insult. Luck's just what you call good engineering you don't understand, he told one young airman who thanked him after a safe landing. Still, every day brought the same frustration. The official maintenance protocols were written thousands of miles away by engineers who'd never faced a firefight. They talked about efficiency, not survivability. Ward saw it differently. Efficiency was fine in a lab. In combat, it killed. When he tried to explain that to his superiors, they called him insubordinate. When he tried to fix things quietly, they called him reckless. The truth was simpler. He couldn't stand watching men die for the sake of a clean blueprint. One cold December evening, he stood alone in Hangar 4, staring at a Sabre stripped bare for inspection. The air reeked of fuel and ozone. He traced a hand along the wiring harness, running through the fuselage, thin, elegant, dangerously exposed. The line carried power from the generator to every critical system, radar weapons, flight controls. If it broke, everything died. He followed the route with a flashlight, counting the connectors, listening to the faint hum of residual current. Then he whispered to the plane as if it could hear him. They gave you beauty, not a chance. The hangar doors creaked open. A young lieutenant stepped in, clipboard in hand. Ward, it's 2,200 hours. What the hell are you doing? Looking for the next ghost? Ward said. The what? The ghost that kills these birds. You just can't see it yet. The officer left, shaking his head. But Ward stayed, sketching a rough plan in his notebook. The idea was forming: if the main line could fail, there had to be another path, a hidden circuit, a lifeline buried deep enough to survive the hit. It wasn't regulation, but it made sense. Machines didn't care about permission. They cared about design. Weeks turned into months, and the pressure mounted. Loss reports stacked high on the commander's desk. The brass blamed pilots, weather, luck, anything but the planes. Ward kept quiet, but inside he was boiling. Each crash felt like a personal insult, a reminder that he was part of a system that refused to see what was right in front of it. Then came the day he couldn't stay silent. A maintenance meeting was held after a string of fatal crashes. The room was full of engineers in clean uniforms, arguing over terminology. One of them, a captain with a degree from MIT, said, "Our data confirms electrical failures were coincidental, not systemic." Ward slammed a spanner on the table so hard the noise silenced the room. "You call coincidence what I call negligence," he said, voice low, shaking. "Those planes didn't fall out of the sky by chance. They were wired to fail." The captain's face went red. "You're out of line, Sergeant." Ward stared him down. "No, sir. I'm just closer to the wreckage." He left before anyone could reply. That night he sat in the empty mess hall drinking cold coffee, thinking of the pilot who died in the last crash. His name, his laughter, the promise that this mission would be easy. Ward's hands clenched. He wasn't angry at the enemy. He was angry at the design, at the blindness, at the arrogance that said theory mattered more than life. He opened his notebook and drew a circle, then a second one inside it. 2 paths, one shadowing the other. "If one dies, the other lives," he murmured. It wasn't poetry. It was survival. The next morning he began collecting scraps, spare wires, burned connectors, anything salvageable. Officially he was repairing ground equipment. Unofficially he was building a prototype that no one had asked for. The others laughed, called it Ward's ghost circuit, but he didn't mind. He knew ghosts had a way of coming back. Every invention starts as defiance. His would be no different. He didn't want medals or approval. He wanted to stop watching the sky swallow men whole. Machines, he'd always said, don't have loyalty, but the people who fly them deserve someone who does. And in the months ahead, that loyalty would turn into something far more dangerous than disobedience. It would become proof, a silent rebellion written in copper and fire, waiting to be discovered. Because Eli Ward wasn't born to follow orders. He was born to make things work when everything else had already failed. The winter wind howled through the hangars, rattling loose sheets of aluminum like hollow bones. Eli Ward stood over a charred hulk of an F-86, his breath forming pale ghosts in the freezing air. The jet looked less like a machine and more like a crime scene. Panels ripped open, wires fused together in melted clumps, instruments burned into silence. He ran his gloved fingers along a section of the fuselage where the paint had blistered off, stopping at a blackened hole no larger than a coin. That hole, made by a single 23mm shell, had turned a $200 000 fighter into a coffin. But what haunted him wasn't the destruction. It was the pattern. Every wreck told the same quiet story, and no one else seemed to be listening. Ward began collecting pieces the investigators didn't bother with. A scorched relay here, a shorted circuit board there. He stored them in a crate marked scrap so the officers wouldn't ask questions. At night, after the others clocked out, he'd spread the debris across the floor of Hangar 4 like puzzle pieces from hell. He traced the flow of power from generator to weapon controls, from fuel pumps to radios. Every wire led back to one place, a single power junction buried deep beneath the cockpit floor. One line, one core, one heartbeat for the entire aircraft. If that junction was severed by flak, by heat, by bad luck, the plane died instantly. Machines weren't supposed to have hearts. They were supposed to have systems. But this was a single vein pulsing through steel wings and fragile flesh, and every enemy bullet knew exactly where to aim. He began comparing wreck after wreck. It didn't matter whether the pilots were rookies or aces, the pattern never changed. Each crash ended with the same burnt scar along the same conduit line. To most mechanics, it looked like coincidence. To Ward, it looked like murder. He mapped out 12 different failures on tracing paper, drawing red lines where the current had stopped. The web of connections converged on that same fatal junction every time. One evening, his crew chief caught him hunched over the diagrams, the lamplight trembling across his face. "Ward, you planning to redesign the damn Air Force?" Eli didn't look up. "No," he said quietly. "Just trying to keep it from killing its own." The chief chuckled and walked off, shaking his head. But Eli stayed staring at the mess of circuits until dawn. Every instinct in his bones screamed that something fundamental had gone wrong, not with the pilots, not with the weather, but with the blueprint itself. He tried to go through official channels first. He drafted a report crisp and detailed, complete with diagrams and photographs from the wrecks. He wrote that the F-86's main electrical artery was a single point of catastrophic vulnerability and recommended immediate field tests for redundant routing. It was technical, precise, and undeniable, or so he thought. The report came back stamped in red, "Are rejected, insufficient evidence." He cornered the base engineer, a pale man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd never touched a cockpit. "Insufficient evidence," Eli demanded. "You've got 12 dead pilots and a dozen planes with the same hole in the same damn place." The man adjusted his glasses. "Correlations aren't conclusions, Sergeant. Unless you can replicate the failure under controlled conditions, it's anecdotal." Ward laughed bitterly. "Controlled conditions? You want me to shoot holes in your airplane till it dies? That controlled enough for you, Sergeant," the engineer snapped. "You're not authorized to perform any experiments." That night, Ward sat in his bunk staring at the rejection letter until the ink blurred. Outside, the roar of departing fighters rattled the windows. He could picture their flight paths arcing into the dark sky, straight into the line of fire. He'd seen too many of them never return. Bureaucracy was killing them faster than bullets. He began keeping his own secret log. Each time a plane went down, he recorded the serial number, the mission altitude, the point of impact. Then he'd slip into the hangar to inspect the remains himself. He learned to recognize the smell of burnt insulation, the metallic tang of ozone and oil. He learned that the damage didn't just kill circuits, it cascaded, shorting every backup through that same central vein. The planes weren't just dying, they were suffocating on their own design. By March, he'd filled 2 notebooks with evidence no one wanted. When the commander announced another equipment review, Ward volunteered for the recovery team. They flew out to retrieve the wreckage of a Sabre that had gone down behind friendly lines. The snow was knee-deep, the air thin and sharp. The jet lay twisted in a crater, its tail section still smoking. Ward crawled into the cockpit, brushing away ash. The power junction was gone, blown apart like a detonated heart. He sat there in silence for a long moment, staring at the wires that once carried life through the plane. Then he whispered to the ghost pilot, "You didn't fail." Back at base, the official investigation blamed enemy flak concentration. Ward wrote in his own notes, "Flak didn't kill this. Design did." He knew now that no memo, no report, no chain of command would fix it. The flaw was invisible to anyone who trusted procedure. It took grease, smoke, and grief to see it clearly. Machines weren't failing, they were following orders written by men who'd never been near death. One evening after another, missions losses came in. Ward walked out to the flight line. The sun was bleeding out behind the mountains, painting the parked Sabres in gold and crimson. He looked at their sleek fuselages, perfect gleaming, lying through their beauty. A captain beside him muttered, "They look damn invincible, don't they?" Ward answered, "That's what scares me." He couldn't unsee the flaw anymore. Every plane waiting for takeoff looked to him like a condemned man who didn't know his sentence. He paced the hangars restlessly, tracing the circuits in his mind, thinking of ways to outsmart the very system that denied him. If the problem was a single point of failure, the solution had to be a second chance, a way for electricity to find another path when death came knocking. But to build it meant defying orders, rewriting the blueprint itself. It meant breaking faith with the manual and keeping faith with the men who flew. He stood before the power distribution diagram, pinned to the hangar wall, and pressed a finger to the junction point that had haunted his dreams. Around him, the base buzzed with routine mechanics, shouting tools, clanging the smell of jet fuel thick in the air. No one noticed when he whispered almost to himself, "If they won't believe the math, they'll believe the proof." The decision settled in him like steel cooling to form. He would stop writing reports. He would stop asking permission. The next test wouldn't be on paper. It would be on a living, breathing Sabre, and if it worked, it could rewrite the odds of war. He turned off the lights and walked out into the cold, the echo of his boots swallowed by the wind. The flaw was no longer hidden. The only question now was how far he was willing to go to fix it. And Eli Ward had already made up his mind. The next time a Sabre took off, it would carry more than a pilot, it would carry his rebellion. Night fell heavy on Kunsan, pressing down like a lid over the hangars. The air buzzed faintly with the aftertaste of electricity, the ghosts of a dozen sorties that hadn't made it home. Eli Ward moved through the shadows like a man trespassing in his own world. Every lamp in Hangar 4 had been turned off, except one, a flickering bulb that threw long, trembling shadows across the stripped fuselage of an F-86 Sabre. He rolled up his sleeves, flexed his hands, and whispered to himself, "Let's give you a second heartbeat." He worked in silence. The only sounds were the clink of tools, the hiss of solder, the slow rasp of his breathing. He'd scavenged the materials from forgotten corners of the base lengths of copper wire salvaged from damaged generators, a handful of burnt relays he'd cleaned and tested by hand, scraps of insulation stripped from radio parts. Every piece had history. Every wire had once failed somewhere. But in Ward's hands, the broken became weaponized salvation. He began mapping the Sabre's nervous system from memory tracing, where power entered and where it died. The main artery, the same one he'd cursed for months, ran clean through the belly of the plane, exposed and arrogant. He spliced into it at 2 points, running a secondary line that hugged the fuselage like a hidden vein. The new line bypassed the central junction entirely, feeding power directly to flight controls and the ignition systems. At each end he installed a small toggle switch cannibalized from an auxiliary panel. Flip it once and the entire aircraft would draw from the secondary circuit. Flip it again and the current returned to normal. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't approved, but it could mean the difference between a flaming crater and a runway. The first test came quietly. A young pilot named Jeffers, who trusted Ward more than he trusted the engineers, agreed to fly a routine check. Ward didn't tell him what he'd done. He just said, "If anything weird happens, trust your hands." That morning, Jeffers's Sabre took a hit over the Yalu River. The main circuit shorted his dashboard, went dark, but the engine never died. When he landed shaken and pale, he said something strange had happened. The lights had come back on after he'd tapped the emergency switch near his knee. Ward only nodded and told him to keep it quiet. Word spread anyway. Pilots began requesting Ward for pre-flight checks. They said the planes he touched flew like they wanted to live. The mechanics joked about it at first, called it Ward's ghost circuit, some invisible trick that kept the jets from joining their dead brothers in the sea. But underneath the laughter, there was awe, a kind of reverent fear, because whatever he'd done, it worked. Ward documented everything, but never officially. Each modification lived only in his grease-stained notebook, the pages filled with crooked diagrams and short notes written in pencil secondary path. Clean power holds at 70%, pilot unaware good. He didn't want signatures, he wanted proof, and proof was coming fast. By the third week, 5 planes had returned from missions with holes through their bellies and systems still running. The pilots swore by him. The officers didn't ask too many questions. He knew what he was doing could end his career, maybe even his freedom. Unauthorized field modifications were punishable under military law, but Ward had stopped caring about the manual the day he'd dragged a dead pilot's helmet out of a burning wreck. He wasn't chasing approval anymore. He was chasing redemption. The nights blurred into one long act of defiance. Sometimes he worked until dawn, his fingers numb, the hangar reeking of solder and sweat. When fatigue hit, he'd sit back against the cold metal of the fuselage and think of the men out there in the dark sky fighting a war measured in seconds. They didn't know his name. They didn't need to. All they needed was for the power to stay alive long enough to bring them home. One night, as he was finishing a new circuit on a Sabre named Blackbird, a fellow mechanic walked in and froze. "Jesus, Ward. What the hell are you doing, saving your ass before it's your turn to go up there?" Ward said, without looking up. The man hesitated, staring at the unfamiliar web of wires and switches. "You know this is illegal, right? They'll hang you for this if something goes wrong." Eli met his eyes. "If it goes right, no one dies. I'll take those odds." The man left without another word. Soon, the airfield itself began to feel haunted. Crews whispered about the Sabres that refused to die, aircraft riddled with bullet holes still limping home with systems humming. One pilot swore his entire cockpit had gone dark before suddenly flaring back to life mid-dive. "Felt like the plane wanted to live," he said. When someone asked who'd last worked on it, the answer was the same every time: Ward. The legend grew faster than the truth could hide. Ward kept his head down, but even the commanders started noticing his section's survival rate. When asked, he gave vague answers about clean wiring luck or pilot discipline, but the gleam in his eyes told a different story, the look of a man who had touched something forbidden and made it obey. Then came the night that would change everything. A storm rolled over Kunsan, hammering the airbase with rain and lightning. Ward was in the hangar finishing a circuit on Red Fox when the door burst open. The operations officer stood there, soaked and furious. "Ward, they're saying you've been rewiring my aircraft without authorization. I want the truth." Ward wiped his hands on a rag, eyes steady. "The truth, sir, is that your aircraft come back. You want to court-martial me for that?" The officer's face darkened. "This isn't about results. It's about procedure." Ward smiled, tired and defiant, "and procedure's been getting men killed." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the hangar like a flashbulb. For an instant, both men stood frozen, soldier and mechanic, regulation and rebellion framed in the blue light of war. The officer turned without another word and left. Ward knew then that the clock had started. Someone would come looking, someone always did. But he also knew something else: the next battle wouldn't be fought in the air. It would be fought in this hangar between truth and authority. Outside, the storm howled, like the engines of 100 returning ghosts. Inside, Eli Ward closed his notebook, slid it under a toolbox and whispered to the sleeping planes, "If they come for me, at least you'll still fly." And by the time dawn broke over the runway, his secret was already too big to hide. The forbidden fix had taken flight, and now the hunt to expose it had begun. By dawn, the rumors had spread across the base like wildfire. Mechanics whispered about the inspection team from Washington, and every wrench stopped mid-turn when the convoy of black sedans rolled through the gates. The air felt heavy, thick with the tension of something inevitable. Eli Ward was in Hangar 4, tightening the last bolt on a fuel line when he heard the footsteps crisp, synchronized official. When he turned, a group of men in clean uniforms and polished shoes stood in the doorway. Their eyes swept the hangar like searchlights. At their center was Colonel Draper, a man carved from regulation itself. "Sergeant Ward," he said flatly, "step away from the aircraft." The next few minutes felt like an execution in slow motion. They surrounded the Sabre he'd modified last night, Red Fox, and began dismantling its panels with surgical precision. It didn't take long before one of the engineers called out, "Sir, this wiring layout isn't in the Boeing schematics." Another voice added, "These circuits are non-standard. There are toggle switches here that don't exist in the manual." The colonel turned toward Eli, his jaw tightening. "You've been tampering with Air Force property, Sergeant. That's a federal offense." Ward wiped his hands calmly on a rag, his heartbeat pounding like a drum in his ears. "I've been keeping your pilots alive," he said. The colonel's voice was ice. "You've been rewriting design doctrine. You had no authorization." "Authorization," Ward snapped, his voice rising. "Tell that to the men who made it home because of this wiring. 7 planes took direct hits and still flew back because of what you're looking at. That's authorization enough for me." The colonel didn't answer. He just nodded to 2 MPs. "Escort him to the briefing room." The interrogation began that afternoon. The room was small, windowless, and smelled of cold metal. A reel-to-reel recorder hummed on the table. Across from him sat 3 engineers from Boeing, 2 officers, and a legal officer who didn't blink once. They fired questions like bullets. "Who told you to modify these planes?" "No one." "Did you record these changes in maintenance logs?" "No." "Do you understand the gravity of violating military design codes?" "I understand gravity just fine. I've watched it pull good men out of the sky." One of the engineers, older than the rest, leaned forward, his voice almost weary. "Do you realize what could happen if your system failed mid-flight? You could kill a pilot." Eli met his gaze. "They were already dying. I just gave them a chance." For a moment silence hung in the room. The old man's eyes softened, but the others pressed on. They demanded proof, not philosophy. Ward had none, only results, only the living. So they decided to test him. Within 48 hours, they turned Hangar 4 into a laboratory. 5 modified Sabres were lined up, each stripped open to reveal the controversial wiring. Engineers crawled through the cockpits, tracing every connection, muttering disbelief. "This is insanity," one said. "The resistance values alone," another began, but was cut off by the colonel. "We're not here to debate. We're here to verify." The test flights were scheduled at dawn. Ward wasn't allowed near the planes, but from the edge of the runway he watched every takeoff with clenched fists. The plan was simple: simulate electrical failure in the air and measure response. The first jet, piloted by Captain Reeves, climbed into the pale morning sky. At 10,000 feet, the radio crackled. Main circuit cut. Switching to auxiliary. Then, after a tense pause, power holding. Systems green. The engineers froze. Draper blinked, then turned to his team. "Run it again." The second jet repeated the test. Same result. Third one, hit by simulated short circuit, recovered within seconds. The backup system worked every single time. Ward watched from below, silent, as data sheets filled with numbers that shouldn't have been possible. When Reeves landed, he jumped from the cockpit, grinning. "Sir, I don't know what kind of black magic's in there, but it damn well works." The colonel stared at Ward for a long time before saying quietly, "Get the Boeing team on record." Hours later, the engineers stood in the hangar, surrounded by the hum of cooling engines. The oldest among them, a grey-haired man named Heller, who had worked on the original Sabre design, ran his hand along the modified panels. "This violates every principle we designed for," he said softly. "Too crude, too redundant. It shouldn't even maintain stable current." "But it does," another whispered. Heller nodded slowly. "It does. I don't understand why, but it saves men." And that means the design was wrong, not the mechanic. The colonel looked between them, expression unreadable. Then he turned to Ward. Effective immediately, you're confined to base until further notice. There will be no disciplinary action pending the report from Washington. You will make yourself available for technical consultation. Ward's voice was quiet, edged with exhaustion. You mean you want me to show them how to do it by the book now? Draper didn't answer. He simply said, You've made a mess, Sergeant. But it's a mess that flies. Over the following weeks, data poured in. The 7 planes Ward had modified were logged as having sustained direct enemy hits and returned safely, a survival rate unheard of in the war. The Air Force couldn't ignore it. Engineers in Washington reviewed the reports in stunned disbelief, and soon whispers of redundant Ward wiring spread beyond Kunsan. But for Eli there was no victory, only a strange, bitter quiet. He still worked in the hangars, though under watch. Sometimes he caught the older engineer Heller studying him with something like respect. One evening, as they checked a panel together, Heller finally said, You know, Sergeant, I still don't know how this works. Ward smiled faintly. It's not supposed to work. It's supposed to survive. The engineer exhaled, half laughing, half in awe. You may have just rewritten combat engineering. Ward looked out toward the runway where another Sabre was taking off into a blood-red sunset. No, he said quietly. I just stopped waiting for permission. The roar of the jet swallowed his words, but Heller heard them anyway. And somewhere deep inside, the system buried under paperwork and pride, a small shift had begun. The man they'd almost court-martialed had just changed the rules of survival, and soon the war would bear his signature whether the brass admitted it or not. The war ended the way most wars do, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The noise faded, the medals were pinned, the papers were filed, and the world moved on. But in a small corner of Texas, far from the sound of jet engines and command radios, a man named Eli Ward opened a shop that sold nothing more dangerous than second-hand radios. The sign above the door said Ward repairs the paint already peeling under the summer Sunday. Inside, the air smelled of solder and dust, a softer echo of the hangars he had once ruled. The hum of old circuits replaced the roar of sabres, but his hands never stopped moving. They never could. He fixed everything the same way he once fixed war machines, with patience, precision, and a quiet defiance of failure. Farmers brought in busted transmitters, truckers brought cracked dials. Sometimes kids wandered in with broken toys and Ward would mend them for free. When people asked if he'd served, he would nod but say little. I kept things running was all he ever offered. The truth didn't fit into words anymore. It lived in silence, in the rhythm of a soldering iron against metal, in the smell of ozone and oil. No one in that dusty town knew that the man repairing their radios had once rewired death itself. No one knew that the system he'd built in secret, the one that had saved pilots over Korea, had quietly become standard practice in every fighter jet the Air Force built afterward. They called it redundant control circuitry, stamped it in manuals, claimed it as engineering evolution, but in the first drawing ever made in a smudged notebook now buried in an archive, it had another name, Ward Circuit, 1952. In 1972, 2 decades after his last act of rebellion, a young engineer named Thomas Riley found that note by accident while cataloguing technical documents at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. The box was unmarked, the papers yellowed with age. Inside were hand-drawn schematics, rough and practical, annotated in pencil, with calculations that broke every formal rule but worked. At the bottom of one diagram in faded ink, he saw a single line of writing, secondary circuit, ensure life continuity, and beneath that, a signature that barely survived Time E. Ward. Riley had never heard the name. There was no record of any E. Ward in the official engineering corps. But the more he studied the diagrams, the more he recognized the DNA of modern flight safety within them, the redundant power grids, the fail-safe switches, the logic of survival built from improvisation. It was as if some ghost mechanic had reached out from the past to whisper a lesson the textbooks had forgotten. Machines are only as moral as the men who build them. He spent weeks trying to trace the origin. He found fragments old maintenance logs from Kunsan, a partial mention in an engineering report, stamped classified, obsolete, and a single name scribbled in a debrief transcript: Sergeant Eli Ward, confined to base March 1953. That was all. No commendation, no medal, not even a note of discharge. Just silence. Riley couldn't let it rest. He wrote to the Air Force Archives, to Boeing, even to the Department of Defense. Every response came back the same. Records unavailable. Finally, an aging clerk at a veteran's office sent him a thin envelope containing one sheet of paper, an obituary clipped from a small-town newspaper. Eli Ward, age 49, passed away peacefully at his home in Abilene, Texas. He is survived by no immediate family. He ran Ward Repairs for 20 years and was known for his generosity and craftsmanship. He was a veteran of the Korean War. No mention of the circuits, the planes, or the lives he saved. Just another mechanic forgotten by the machinery of history. Riley sat in his office that night, staring at the obituary. He felt something twist in his chest. Anger, admiration, sorrow, all at once. He looked again at the smudged signature on the schematic. It wasn't just handwriting. It was a manifesto written in grease and defiance. Ward hadn't built a system. He'd built a philosophy that survival mattered more than procedure, that saving a man was worth breaking every rule written by someone who'd never seen death up close. The young engineer decided to make things right in his own small way. When he published a paper on field-driven redundancy design a year later, he added a dedication at the bottom. It read simply, "To the unnamed mechanic who made the impossible fly." Word spread through the engineering community. Some dismissed it as legend, others dug deeper. Slowly, the myth of Ward's ghost circuit resurfaced, not as superstition, but as history. At museums and technical schools, instructors began telling the story of a mechanic who had risked his career to give pilots a fighting chance. Students listened in disbelief, their clean hands tracing the same wiring patterns Ward had drawn by lantern light. Meanwhile, halfway across Texas, his shop had been abandoned. Dust covered the benches, where he once bent copper and soldered life into dead machines. The radio on his counter still worked barely, and when the wind blew through the broken window, it hummed faintly like a pulse that refused to fade. Decades later, an Air Force historian visiting the archives at Dayton stumbled upon Ward's notebooks. They were transferred to the museum's technical exhibit, tucked beside the blueprints of the Sabre. Tourists rarely noticed them, but sometimes a veteran would stop, trace the name on the cover with his finger, and whisper, "He's the reason I came home." In the end, that was the only legacy Ward ever wanted, not medals, not headlines, just proof that his work had outlived him. And it had. The same logic that once defied the Air Force now powered spacecraft, submarines, and passenger jets. Every redundant circuit, every backup power route, every fail-safe in modern aviation carried a piece of his rebellion. The Air Force never issued an official commendation. Bureaucracy rarely honors heretics. But in 1983, the Engineering Corps quietly updated a training module with a note that read, "Redundant circuit concepts first observed in Korean warfield modifications, author unknown." They knew his name, they just chose not to say it. Still, the silence suited him. Ward had never sought applause. He'd sought function. His work was proof that sometimes the smallest act of defiance can echo longer than any command. If someone had walked into that dusty shop in Abilene during his last years and asked what he thought about the war, he probably would have shrugged, turned a knob and said, "Machines don't have loyalty. People do." And that was the truth he'd left behind the blueprint, not just for survival, but for integrity. In a world built on protocol and obedience, he'd chosen compassion as his command. His story wasn't about breaking rules, it was about rewriting the cost of following them. Because not every hero wears rank or rides into battle. Some work in silence, hands stained with oil hearts, wired to the belief that saving one life is worth every regulation broken. And somewhere above the clouds, where modern jets slice through the sky, a faint echo still lingers in the circuits, a pulse, a whisper, a hum that says, "Ward was here." The sky that once roared with war had grown quiet, but the hum of Eli Ward's defiance still lived somewhere inside every machine that carried a human life aloft. His story was never written in medals or memorials. It was etched into the circuitry of survival itself. Every time a pilot flipped a switch and the backup system came alive, that was his legacy, whispering through the wires a silent promise that no man would fall for the same mistake twice. History forgot his name as it does with most who choose integrity over recognition. But the truth of his work endured because truth has its own current. It moves unseen, bypassing bureaucracy, the way Ward's circuit bypassed failure. The system that once condemned him eventually adopted him, though it never admitted it. His rebellion became regulation. His defiance became doctrine. That was his quiet revenge to live forever in the machines he once fixed in secret. Decades later, when engineers teach about redundancy, they call it logic. When they talk about reliability, they call it science. But Ward knew it was something deeper: faith. Faith that even when everything goes dark, there's always another path, another spark waiting to carry you home. So when the engines thunder above the clouds and the lights flicker but never die, somewhere in that steady pulse of power lives the ghost of a mechanic from Texas who once dared to believe that a single life was worth breaking every rule. Because not every hero is forged in battle. Some are built in the quiet after with nothing but wire will and the courage to keep the world running when everyone else has already given up.